It's Christmas time at the time of this recording. Look at this. I've got a huge package for you in shape of my top 10 list of TV show episodes of all time. Well, yeah, I was just thinking I was gonna talk about 10 of my favorite TV show episodes of all time. Now, there's a lot. Funny enough, I haven't seen a lot of those so-called greats. I haven't seen Game of Thrones. I haven't seen The Wire. I haven't seen Sopranos. I haven't seen Stranger Things. You know, like a lot of the shows that a lot of people talk about I haven't seen. So if any episodes from those shows are not here, then that's why. This is also not a set in stone, my top 10 list of TV show episodes of all time. This is just a collection of a lot of episodes that I would like to talk about. It's like, out of these 10 episodes, this is probably the order that I would rank them in terms of quality. Maybe not. It's like just quite a subjective ranking for me of just how much I like one or the other one. In terms of quality, I would probably switch it around a little bit, and some episodes maybe don't deserve to be in here on that list, but in general, it's just a lot of episodes that I feel like I have a good connection to and would like to talk about a little bit. And if you didn't figure out that already, of course, spoiler warning for anything that I'm talking about. Number 10, Al Fin Cayo, which is the season finale of season 2 of Narcos. Now, Narcos, the first 2 seasons being the depiction of the rise and fall of Pablo Escobar's cocaine empire. The series has gotten to the point right now where Pablo Escobar is in hiding and he's been on the run for a long time, and now he is isolated in this small apartment in Medellin. Now we do have the son of Colonel Martinez, who is sitting in this tracking van trying to listen into phone calls all over the city and trying to find out where Pablo Escobar is, because they know he's in Medellin. And right away I do want to say that I actually really like the relationship in between Hugo Martinez and Hugo Martinez Jr. It's one of those relationships where the father is like a military colonel, so it's, you know, very square, and the son being someone who has been raised in the same way of being like very respectful, calling them sir, standing attention, and like handshakes and, you know, all of that whole thing, right? And that's something that we've seen a lot in different stories before, but it's always framed as this super toxic and awful environment to be in. It's just a breath of fresh air of seeing those instances where it actually works in the father-son relationship, because you can tell that Martinez talks to his son as if he is a soldier beneath him, but Martinez is then also talking as if he is one of the best colonels, actually making sure that his soldiers are being taken care of and that they're doing alright. And in general, I just like the mutual respect that's in between these two characters. But it's also fascinating because we get to the point where Pablo Escobar has been isolated for such a long time that now he's reached the point where he's like, you know what, I'm not gonna stay captive anymore. This is my city and I'm gonna go out there. So he goes, I think he gets like an ice cream or a coffee. Then he just walks to town square and he look at people just walking by and kids playing football, and that's also a moment where it is that he is picturing a moment to talk with Gustavo, and it pretty much acts as like a heart-to-heart where it is that Pablo like expresses how much Gustavo actually meant to him. It's interesting because seeing these moments over here and seeing Pablo kind of look around it, I mean, it's obviously him like walking down memory lane, but it also serves as a little bit of an insight of what Pablo Escobar ultimately could have been. Like, if it was that he wasn't so greedy and hungry for power and so prideful, then he actually could have become this member of the people and someone that was very loved and respected in his community. Because of course he did all of his charity and philanthropy. He ultimately did that to gain an edge, to have the people on his side whilst he was working against the government. But seeing in a situation like this that he actually could have worked like that without the criminal intentions, you know? But then seeing what ultimately kills him is that he does one final attempt to talk to Tata and is coming up with a plan of how it is that he's eventually gonna break out of his isolation. He just directly reverts back to what it is that he's always done. He always tries to feed this bullshit to the media about how he is the victim, how the press and the police is violating his rights and all of this ridiculous stuff. And ultimately what makes Martinez Jr. pick up his signal on the phone and then also spot him in the window. So they locate him. Then we get a very intense shootout scene. It's very interesting as well because in this final scene we see that Escobar is of course in his regular sweatpants and whatever he's been wearing over there, but he's also in flip-flops. It's a very interesting detail because one of the first lines in the show is Steve Murphy in the narration saying
79, the bad guys I was chasing wore flip-flops.
Kind of talking about that he was just chasing these bum drug dealers in California on the beach. Then now over time he was leveling up to more heavy-hitting criminals. But then this also then plays into the last thing that Steve Murphy says.
For years I've been building this son of a bitch up in my head. What a monster he'd be. But here's the thing. When you lay eyes on him, the devil's a real letdown. Just a man. Beard grows if he doesn't shave. Fat and shoeless.
But kind of funny it coming full circle with the setup of the flip-flops in the first episode, you know? We then get a montage of pretty much everybody involved getting a reaction to hearing the news that Escobar has died. And my favorite is to see the reaction of Tata, so his wife, but also his mother as well. When we see it from their perspective, it's very fascinating to see, because obviously since Escobar is someone who has put them through a lot of dangerous encounters and traumatic events and put them in danger a lot, when you boil down to it, emotionally, he was a really, really good father and son, because his family loved him like nothing else and they have endless loyalty to him. And it's so interesting to see as well when we see the real life footage of Pablo's mother giving her speech, and I love that the show has that intercut with a montage of the endless death and destruction and torture and torment that has plagued Colombia for years whilst he's been in power. It's just a very interesting to cut in between those two. I think it's a very satisfying ending to two fantastic seasons of television. First two seasons of Narcos can heavily recommend. So in my number 9 spot, I have the finale to Chernobyl. Is titled Viknaya Pamyat. After 4 episodes of very intense build-up, we now finally get a detailed version of what it was that happened and caused the explosion. Now, Chernobyl as a show has some of the best structuring that I've ever seen in any story ever. It is absolutely insane how well they managed to string along the audience in what information is being revealed to us, and how that also strings us along emotionally with what's going on in the show. Now in the show you can see all throughout the first 4 episodes how the Soviet Union to a large part is to blame of the aftermath of the explosion. How much misinformation was spreading around of what was actually going on and the significance of it. The budget cuts of like the equipment that was being sent over there. The shifting of blame in between the staff, and like just a lot of stuff that made this whole situation very difficult. We see so many times of how the state of the Soviet Union is constantly watching our main characters and everybody important in the cause, right? And quietly controlling everyone. That, combined with the very incompetent and reckless management of Fomin, Brukhanov and Dyatlov. But this is the episode that reveals that the Soviet Union isn't only to blame for how difficult it was to deal with this whole accident, they are also responsible for the main design flaw that in turn also caused the reactor to explode. Now the writing in this episode is fantastic at showing just how much this is personally gonna cost to Legasov of actually revealing this information out there. I mean, throughout the episode we have a lot of moments where it is that Legasov is constantly being pushed from all different directions and trying to convince him to reveal this in court and in turn to the world as well. But they also build it up where you could tell that it's forever gonna destroy his life and career. He's never gonna get a job again and he's never gonna be remembered by everyone. And also, we don't even know if it's gonna have a difference or not. He also says at one point,
"This is a show trial. The jury's already been handed their verdict."
I'm not talking about them.
Which in turn means that, like, okay, he might reveal everything out there and destroy everything for himself, but will it make a difference? We don't know. It's also a fantastic interaction between Legasov and Khomyu, where he says,
"I went willingly to an open reactor, so I've already given my life. Isn't that enough?"
No, I'm sorry, but it is not.
Because Khomyu is also someone that has shown to actually know the significance of the situation to the point where it's like, okay, it might end everything for you, but you're the only one that has the power to make a difference right here. Whether it does or not actually doesn't matter. This is the only chance we have, you know? It is also so extremely impressive that they managed to map out every event in a second-for-second timeline of what it caused the explosion to occur. And that they managed to explain this, whether if you have an understanding of that kind of physics or none at all, you still can very comprehensively follow along. But also that they managed to to structure it in a way where it does not feel like heavy-handed or spoon-fed. It feels very natural in how they reveal this information. But all of that combined with that, it's extremely intense as well. The way that they tell this story in court is incredible. We also finally see Boris give Legasov the acknowledgement and the respect that he deserves. And Boris also kind of coming to realize how little he helped before he got connected to this accident and before it was that he was called in.
I hoped that one day I would matter, but I didn't. I just stood next to people who did.
The whole episode is jam-packed with incredible lines of dialogue. In general, it's just a fantastic ending to, one of the best shows ever. Certainly my pick for my favorite historical piece, I think I want to say. In my number 8 spot is Season 1, Episode 4 of True Detective, called Who Goes There? Ah yes, True Detective, the show that had one of the greatest seasons of television ever to begin with and never managed to live up to the same level again, unfortunately. To be honest, kind of just going downhill over time, which is, it's sad, but yeah, that's TV for you. So halfway through the first season, Rust and Marty have gotten a crucial lead in the case of trying to find a man called Reggie Ledoux. Now to do this, Marty then goes undercover to this club way out in the boonies that's full of like bikers and criminals and drug dealers and all kinds of gangbangers, right? There he learns that the crew that operates with Ledoux as of right now is the same crew that Rust used to work with back when he was undercover years ago. So then Rust, off the record, he goes like full method into this undercover situation again. He takes leave from work and then he spends a few days hanging around that club so people spot him, and then he eventually gets a meeting with like the leader of that gang. So then he tries to do that to try and find Reggie Ledoux, since Reggie cooks drugs for that crew specifically. But to be able to get in, he has to take like multiple kinds of drugs to show that he is like trustworthy and he's actually in the gang again. But he also has to do a favor for Ginger, who's the leader. The way to prove his alliance over there is that he's going to commit armed robbery along with the other white supremacists from this gang. And what follows is an extremely intense scene. I mean, alongside that, we also have a development with Marty where it is that the moment where Lisa finally goes to Maggie and tells them about his and Marty's affair. And it, of course, spins Marty fully out of control and he feels like he's losing grasp on everything around. Of course, Marty is a character who has been shown throughout the previous 3 episodes that he doesn't really take responsibilities. He tends to shift the blame a lot. So then he is trying to plead his apology towards Maggie, but of course Maggie can recognize his patterns and know that it's a little bit bullshit as of right now. Marty gets very distressed about it, but ultimately the episode is mostly focusing on Rust. Man, that whole robbery sequence that we have, for starters, is directed to be in one take. And it's very interesting to see as well because Rust gets into character right away. He did this for 5 years earlier, so he can get into it relatively quickly. But it's also interesting when it is that they perform the robbery and Rust moves around in the apartment. He moves exactly like you would think a cop would do when it is that they're doing a raid. So it's interesting with body language of that. Is that the body language that came from his time as an undercover gangbanger, or did that come from his time as a policeman? A little bit similar behavior in those instances, right? I mean, it's intense as hell, it's violent as hell as well. At the same time that all this action is happening, it gives a lot of insight to what Rust's life must have been like when he was a undercover all those years ago. The heavy drug use and the morally shady acts that he had to commit to be able to maintain that undercover identity, right? But it's also just endlessly impressive because McConaughey essentially has to play 3 different characters all at the same time over here. He has to play Rust the policeman, his actual character that he has in the show. He has to play Crash, the undercover identity that he uses, and those two whilst high on cocaine and probably some other drugs as well. So there's 3 things going on at the same time, and McConaughey is expressing so much. It's utterly insane seeing him balancing these 3 characters back and forth, and the performance that comes out in this episode is extremely impressive. It's the reason why it goes down as one of the greatest television seasons of all time. And even though True Detective has produced 2 mediocre seasons and 1 bad seasons of television afterwards, it's still within the top 30 shows of all time or something like that. That's riding off the strength of the first season. It is genuinely that good. In my number 7 spot, I play Season 1, Episode 20 of Lost, titled Do No Harm. Now, I feel like this episode is the closest we would come to reality. If people were to crash on a deserted island like this, I feel like the vibe of this episode would be every fucking day. Meaning, This episode is stressful as hell. Crisis after crisis after crisis. So Boone, having just been in the accident with Locke in the previous episode where the plane fell over and he got crushed by all the content inside and he's fucked up, to say the least, he's now in dire condition. So Jack, of course, being the doctor, tries to start operating him, caring for him right away, but we can tell pretty quickly that this is not going to be an easy surgery to make. But it is fun to see him teaming up with Sun as well, her being like kind of the nurse assistant in the operating room at this time. They have a very fun like medical dynamic in between them. I mean, Sun actually comes through with a lot of creative solutions of actually getting the sea urchin needle to be able to give a blood transfusion later, which then also leads to a tremendous joke coming after that when Jack is just given a stupid amount of blood to Boone. He then walks out to Hurley and...
Hurley. Whoa, dude. You alright, man? You're looking kind of goth.
But in the midst of like getting a blood transfusion, finding a good enough needle, finding out people's blood types, popping Boone's leg back into place, and also just finding out what happened in general, right? That was interesting as well, because Kate gets sent to run to the beach to get Sawyer and all of his alcohol. And it's funny because, I mean, throughout the show we've seen that every time anybody asks Sawyer for something, he always messes around and is an asshole about it. That's, you know, a big part of his character, right? But I like in this moment where he can tell that it is like very serious and urgent right away, then there's no hesitation. He does help out. I think this is a very great character moment to have with that. But then when Kate is running on her way back, she also stumbles onto Claire. And then we're hit with some of the shittiest timing ever.
Oh God. You're having a baby.
It's funny to see as well, because when it is that Kate is over there, she can tell that Claire is so uncomfortable and Kate cannot leave right now. So she can't leave, but the alcohol needs to get to Jack ASAP, but help also had to get to them. So she has no other options. What can she do but...
Help! Somebody help!
Yeah, scream and help. You have no other choice at this point. I mean, that's something that we've seen in other stories before and it always feels very goofy, but in this instance, she genuinely doesn't have a better option. So Jin, being the only one that hears this, he runs over there and Kate has to then give him instructions and tell him just like, Jack, doctor, go. And one of my favorite moments is when it is that Jin eventually reaches camp, because just a few episodes prior, everybody, including Jin, found out that Sun spoke fluent English and have been learning it behind Jin's back because she had the intention of leaving him. So there was of course a huge fight and a huge betrayal over there in between each other. So this is the first time that they see each other. He runs in, and there is, of course, this moment of awkward silence in between them, but they very quickly, it's just like, you know what, this is more important than whatever we have going on. So they just immediately goes into, he starts talking, she starts translating for him. I just love the fact that they took the time to actually hold that moment a little bit, you know? And Jack also has the funniest reaction when Jin reveals that Claire is into labor. You can tell that Jack is kind of just like, Lord, why do you test me? Why do you do this to me? Because this is just like the absolute shittiest timing ever. But he comes with very easy to understand and very good instructions to give to Kate so that Charlie can deliver that to her. And I think the choice to have Kate be the one delivering the baby is also a very, very strong moment, because ultimately you can tell that she's terrified at the thought of having to do this, but she then in this episode also actually takes on the responsibility and delivers the baby, and it's a very, very strong character moment for Kate, Claire, Charlie, and everyone involved. But it's also a moment where it is that the intensity of the surgery on Boone is building up, and here we then get into the whole thing of Jack's inability to let go of stuff. And it's interesting thinking about that as well, because when it was that he eventually was operating on Sarah, he fucked up, but then he endured through that fear and just eventually powered through. That kind of showed him in that instance that he was just like, okay, never give up. It also can be the moments of, you know, the sheriff with the shrapnel in the first episodes that had no right staying alive for that long. The fact that Jack was trying to save him even though most people understood that he wouldn't be able to live and that he was just going through so much pain from it. It's all about knowing when to let go and not, right? So it's a fantastic moment where it is that we see Boone being like,
I know you made me. I promise. I'm letting you off the hook.
and Jack finally lets go of Boone. It's a strong moment. It's a very strong moment for Jack's character. And then also the absolute heartbreaking ending of Shannon's reaction to Boone's death is, it's rough to watch. All in all, it's an incredibly intense episode, and it has some really, really strong character moments all throughout it. So that's ultimately why I think it ends up as my favorite one. Now in my number 6 spot, I have season 1 episode 6 of Squid Game, titled Gambu. Oh, Squid Game is a fascinating one, you know. The most successful show that has ever been on Netflix. And it's in Korean. Everybody talked about it, but it's also interesting to see how the discussion about Squid Game has disappeared relatively quickly after it was finished, you know? Now, I ultimately think the show in totality averages out at maybe like a 4.55 out of 10-ish. But the reason for that, though, is because there is one storyline that's pretty darn great, and there's one storyline that is absolutely horrific. There's a lot of great things in Squid Game, but there's unfortunately a lot, and I would probably argue more, that is really, really, really bad. But episode 6 is the episode where you get a lot of those highs with very, very little downfall. So the initial reveal of the game is something that worked really well for me as well, because ultimately all the games leading up to this point have been trying to focus a lot on teamwork and companionship and brotherhood, right? And it's so fascinating because then when you hear that it's a game that you play in pairs, then a lot of people are teaming up with the people they think are going to give them the biggest chances to ultimately get through. They're either choosing the partner that they want to work together with, or the person that they think they will compensate each other and have the best strengths together. Then they reveal that the game is played towards each other. So those two people taking it out. And the reveal of that is something that just hits fantastically right off the bat. You see everybody's facial expressions switch on a dime, and it's also heartbreaking to see, for example, the married couple who came there together, them looking at each other like, what the hell, you know? But it's also really fascinating seeing how Sang-woo's demeanor changes instantly. You know, it goes from, okay, teamwork, we're gonna get through it together, we're gonna be the superior team over here. His demeanor instantly changing afterwards. Now, I really, really like the structure and the pacing of this episode. You have like 4 different games that are playing out at the same time that we are following, and I think it's structured very well, cutting in between those 4 to kind of bring the pacing together and also the emotional pacing of the whole thing. So we have, for example, the 2 gangsters that had teamed up together because they thought they were going to be like the gangbangers of the whole show, but now ultimately when they go against each other, you can tell that they both know that only one of them is going to walk out alive, which then leads to them to being brutally honest and hostile towards each other, right? Not necessarily that has a lot of emotional impact, but I think it's quite a genius idea having this almost action film cutting in between the different games. Now you also have our main character Gi-han, who is playing with the old man. It's a very strong team up because the episode starts off with him noticing that the old man has peed himself because he's scared, so then Gi-han offers his jacket to him to kind of protect him. Then later when it is that they're supposed to choose teammates, then he can tell that the old guy started to walk towards him and he's like, oh, old man, I'm sorry, I don't think it's a good idea. But then the old guy also recognizes, yeah, of course, you don't want to be with me. Take your jacket back, you're gonna look weak if you don't have it. So immediately they're very, very kind towards each other, and Gi-han is trying to find another teammate, but ultimately his sympathy of seeing the old man alone makes him choose him so that they play together. Now, having that thing play out, Gi-han is losing quite tremendously, and the old man, as always throughout the show, is taking everything very playfully and childlike almost. But then Gi-han notices his dementia and uses it against him.
잠깐만요. 홀. 뭐라고 했지?
And it's fantastically directed of this because you can see that Gi-han takes absolutely no pleasure in doing this whatsoever. But he ultimately needs to do what he needs to do to survive, you know? And that whole thing ultimately culminating in the old guy confronting him like, oh, yeah, I knew what you did, motherfucker. But it's okay. You take the marbles. I wasn't gonna get out of here anyways. I just enjoyed playing. And remember, we're Ganbu. That's like the title of the episode, which is supposed to talk about how your teammates, and it doesn't matter who goes through it, they share everything. So then he's like, we're teammates, so you go ahead for me, you know? There's a very emotional conclusion to it, and it's directed fantastically and acted tremendously in between the two as well. Then we also have the 2 girls. The girl that we know from before, I think is called Kabyok, and then the new girl that we haven't really seen that much of. But that's also a very, very interesting dynamic, because we have our main girl that has been, throughout the show, she's always been very stone-faced and kind of just not really showing a lot of emotions, always looking very serious, but it's interesting because she has been able to communicate a lot of emotions with her lack of expression, if that makes sense. But then having her team up with this other girl who is extremely like careless and nonchalant and doesn't really take the whole game seriously, they get a very interesting dynamic in between the two. And then, you know, the second girl also says like, let's just throw everything on the line for it, one game, win or lose. And then it's just like, okay, so what do we play? And she's like, hey, chill, we got 30 minutes, why don't we just sit and talk? We get some very interesting dialogues in between there where we hear the backstory of the new girl and the very tragic backstory that she comes from.
학교 갔다 집에 돌아오니까 엄마가 방바닥에 누워서 죽어 있었어. 그 옆엔 아버지란 인간이 칼을 들고 서 있었고, 그 다음으로 본 건 우리 아버지시지. 그 옆에 칼을 들고 서 있던 건 나였고.
And then we also hear Kabyok's motivation to get out because she ultimately has a son who lives in an orphanage and she's trying to get him out of there, you know? So she has a motivation, and then that ultimately leads to the second girl being like, I don't really have anything out there. I kind of joined this game because I didn't have anything to risk, you know? So then having that moment, and also the second girl ultimately giving her life, you know? Then I love the reaction of Kabyok being so emotionally distraught that she's like, do you expect me to thank you from this? Like, what the fuck are you doing, you know? And then the ultimate conclusion of that hits fantastically because of what we learned about those characters, but also because of the incredible acting from those two. I actually think that the second girl's performance in this very scene is my choice for the best acting in the entire show. However, the most interesting one is the game between Sang-woo and Ali. Now, of course, Sang-woo is someone who has been a little bit in the background and started to come a little bit further forward because he's showing that he is extremely intelligent, he's very, very smart, and we've had moments before where it is that he is very sympathetic and he is essentially a good guy. You've gotten those breadcrumbs of that he could be someone who would betray someone else the same himself. That definitely could happen, but it would only be if he needed to, you know? You also have Ali, who has been nothing but altruistic and kind and a good guy to everyone involved. One of the first things he does in the show is that he saves Gi-han in the very first game in the first episode. First moment we see of him. Seeing Sang-woo's demeanor change so many times throughout the episode is so interesting because you can tell he is always trying to navigate in what he thinks is the way to manipulate Ali over. He at first explodes on Ali thinking that Ali would be someone who would fold and be like, hey, okay, we start over. Then when he notices that that doesn't work, he eventually goes to pathetic mode and like begs him to start the game over and becomes like very vulnerable. Then when that doesn't work, he's just like, okay, you know what? He gives this whole explanation of how they're gonna find other people that also can't solve the game, so then they're gonna play 2v2, so then both Sang-woo and Ali can come out. I mean, it would kind of make sense. For example, the married couple, they probably wouldn't want one of them to go through and not the other, so they would probably be down to play a 2v2, you know? But ultimately he does all this so that he can very sneakily switch out the marble bags, and he takes all of Ali's marbles, and he eventually walks out, leaving Ali behind. And it just hits tremendously because A, it shows a lot of his character, but it solidifies Sang-woo as the main antagonist of the episodes coming forward. Man, that direction. Ali was just such a good guy. He was such a good guy, and he was my favorite character up until this point as well. And seeing him get backstabbed like that from Sang-woo is nothing other than meaningful. It's heartbreaking to see, and it's excellently made. Now, as I mentioned, Squid Game is a show that has a lot of really, 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 really awful stuff, but it has a lot of really good stuff, and especially this episode is excellent. Number 5 is Season 1, Episode 6 of The Haunting of Hill House, titled Two Storms. So after we've gotten 5 previous episodes that have mapped out the backstory of every child character in detail, now we eventually get pretty much the first scene where we see all of them interacting in a large part together. And this is an episode that is structured in a way that they're exploring experiences that their family has had during 2 storms in their life. One storm was back when they were kids in Hill House, and one storm is right now just before Nell's funeral. So it is an episode that features both scenes in the present, but also in the past. Now they decided to do this whole episode, including transitions, mostly in one take. I mean, the strong suit of Hill House is his characters. The characters of the 5 kids are fantastic, and there are some excellent character moments in this episode. There's a huge argument and fight that breaks out in between virtually everyone involved in that place, and it comes along so organically, it doesn't feel forced whatsoever. The reason for it is because it ultimately starts out with just everybody sitting and reminiscing about Nell. Luke talking about the words that she would make up, why it was made up, and her kind of imaginations as a kid. And then also the father telling some backstories and ultimately saying she used to write me every month to tell me how good you guys were doing. And then that spirals a little bit, and eventually Steven picks up on that and says like,
You said Nellie wrote you a letter once a month?
Yeah, that's right.
So maybe she mentioned something in one of her monthly letters that might have raised the flag about, I don't know, her state of mind.
That eventually spirals into a lot of different stuff. We have tensions and conflicts that have been set up in the past 5 episodes, and it's all rising up right now. Steven capitalizing on their traumas. Theo taking the money from Steven. Hugh never telling the kids what happened to their mom or why she died. Kevin taking the money from Steven behind Shirley's back. It's so extremely intense because there are so much stakes that have been set up in the past 5 episodes. And it's really, really powerful. This just makes me think of everything that Marvel has produced since Infinity Wars, anything that Star Wars has produced since the prequels. Maybe that's Disney at fault, but their idea of raising the stakes is always to times 10. Do bigger, do more, everything like that. And it just never really feels like more intense. Here, this is more intense than anything that has ever come out of Marvel, and it's literally just characters talking in a room about someone taking a check behind someone's back. And it has 10 times the intensity that anything that has come out of Marvel has. Oh, I don't want to focus on Marvel right now. I mean, this show is known for its incredible attention to hidden details. Even in this episode, you have that wide shot with all the characters, and Nell is standing in the background of the shot. I didn't even notice on the first watch. But then you also have when the mom is walking around in the rooms, she walks into this one room and you see the statue in the background, and at that moment has their head turned away, and when she walks back out, the head is turned around and looking at her. Fantastic detail. There are details like this throughout the entire season. These are 2 of my favorites. Now, I can't even imagine what it must have been like for Mike Flanagan to go to Netflix and say, hey, I'm going to do this episode with like 15 minutes long one takes with child actors. I can't even imagine how he managed to convince them, let alone being able to perform it and make it as freaking perfect as they did. Because it's not only that they do the thing where they spin around Hugh and we see a change from the adult actors to child actors back to the adult actors, and a lot of details that are all happening when it's still one take. But also they're walking from one set to the other set, which means that they must have built a humongous extension in between the 2 sets. Now that's probably why they cut over there, because the 2 sets in actuality are not connected, but it's still incredibly impressive to me. The acting from all of the actors is fantastic, but also the child actors, especially in this episode, is bloody brilliant. Seeing that interaction in between Nell and Luke, I'm looking at them and I'm like, how are you giving off a better performance than most adults? The crazy thing about it, kid Nell is 12 when recording this. Luke is 7. He's 7 years old, performing like this.
I thought the whole things had got you. I thought they took you.
Fucking insane. Now, The Haunting of Hill House is some of my favorite horror that has ever been produced. And it produced 9 of the best episodes of television I had ever seen in my life. Unfortunately, there's 10 episodes of the show. And my number 4 pick is Season 4, Episode 12 of Dexter, titled The Getaway. This is the finale to the greatest season of Dexter and what I consider to be the end of the brilliant run that Dexter had. Since Dexter has the structure of having every season be about a specific case, then The Getaway is then the conclusion to the Trinity Killers, in the same way that Season 1 was the Ice Truck Killer, Season 2 was Bayaba Butcher, and the thing is, I also think that this episode acts more or less as a conclusion to the first 4 seasons. Because the thematic through line throughout the season, but also the whole show, is essentially Dexter's relationship to Rita and the kids in his family. Because of course, in the very beginning, Rita and the kids were purely cover. They were purely disguised to be able to blend into society. And as the seasons went on, he was starting to grow attached to them and starting to care for them. And ultimately, he held a lot of things back all the time, and he was constantly trying to balance it out because he knew, as his dark passenger is essentially what takes over, and he has moments where he thinks that he might be, but he always concludes, I'm not good for them. Because he thinks that as long as he has the dark passenger, he will always be bad for them. But he always tried to do better, and it's very fascinating because in this very episode, we have the moment where Dexter gets pressed by the police and this civilian, and he eventually lashes out because of the stress that he has behind him, and that eventually puts him in prison overnight. And then he gets picked up by Rita, him thinking it's over, they're finally gonna see me for who I am, or they're finally gonna see the dark passenger. He also gets the same feeling from Deborah when Deborah has eventually uncovered that Harry was having an affair with Laura Moser, mother of Dexter and Brian Moser. So when he hears that, he's also thinking, it's over, she's gonna see me for who I am, she knows where I come from, she knows about my dark passenger. But in both instances, with both Rita and with Deborah, it eventually leads to a moment where they say, it doesn't matter about what baggage you have. Your good parts weigh up for everything else. So he's always been thinking that the dark passenger is ultimately gonna be bad for them all the time. But then they say that it doesn't matter what you have behind you, your good parts weigh up for everything else. Essentially, Trinity acts a little bit like a mirror to Dexter of what Dexter would have been like if he didn't have the code of Harry. If he didn't have the moral compass, he would have turned into this terrible, terrible man who has been terrorizing his family for years and is danger to everyone and everything around him. So Dexter hearing what Deborah and Rita say, but also getting to know the true side of Trinity, then that's what he's thinking. The code of Harry and my good parts is ultimately what differentiates Dexter from the Trinity Killer.
You think you're better than I am?
No. But I want to be.
The finale is also so fantastic of having the very calm usage of the main theme and the very optimistic ending when Dexter is realizing I'm actually good for the people around me, and it's okay. Life doesn't have to be perfect, but I'm gonna try my best to make everything to be perfect. Now, unfortunately, that's not reality. No matter how good you can be to anyone or how good you can be to your family or your partner or the people around you, ultimately spending your nights sneaking around and murdering people every day and living a double life like that is not something that is realistic. And that's why I absolutely adore the finale of this, because there they show us that it's not reality, and if you do something like that, this ultimately is the consequences. Dexter comes home and Harrison is sitting in the pool of his mother's blood, and Rita's laying in the bathtub, just in the same way that Arthur had killed all those other women. It hits heavy. It's also fantastic usage of horror in a way as well, because we know how Trinity used to do these kills. We saw a scene of it in the very first episode. We know how graphic and gruesome and horrible and traumatic something like this is. But Rita's dead now, and so is Trinity. So we don't know, and we will never know what Rita experienced there, what Arthur told her, what he did to Rita before she died. We'll never know that. It's a very powerful stroke of reality of seeing how sometimes stuff like that happens. Tragedy strikes and no one will ever know how it came about. It's excellent. It's fantastic.
You'll still be you.
I have a family too, Arthur. I'm good. For them.
You're like a child.
Nothing is inevitable.
It's already over. It's already over.
Now, of course, the series as a whole does go drastically downhill from here, and even though they do have a few highlights, it ultimately goes drastically downhill, and it, alongside Lost as well, has one of the worst endings to any television show ever. But if you haven't seen it already, seasons 1 to 4 of Dexter is excellent. It's absolutely brilliant. Now, my pick for number 3 is Season 1, Episode 3 of Arcane, titled The Base Violence Necessary for Change. The conclusion to the first act of Arcane. It's very interesting hearing myself and other fans of Arcane talk to people who haven't seen Arcane before. Because of course it being an animated show based off a video game is not necessarily something that attracts a big audience. So whenever I or other people recommend the show, you almost always say, see the first 3 episodes. Now, we say that because episode 3 is that good that it will essentially hook anyone. Now in the first 2 episodes, we very much have set up the landscape of having Vander being kind of like the peacekeeper of the Undercity, making sure that they don't attack or mess with anything in Piltover, was Grayson being kind of the peacekeeper of Piltover and making sure that the enforcers don't swarm the streets of the Undercity. Of course, the landscape is critical and on the brink of civil war the whole time. Endless conflicts and hatred in between the two factions. Now, when it is that Vi and Powder eventually thinks they're gonna try and get a little bit of a bigger score in Piltover rather than around in the Undercity, that of course has severe consequences as they cause an explosion, and then the enforcers and the government of the Piltover demand to get a full dog. And then Vander is realizing more and more that they need a full dog and he's not going to be able to get around that, but he also refuses to give up his daughters. Ultimately, he will give up himself, which is something that's going to have horrific consequences as well, because he is the sole purpose of the peace being kept in between Piltover and the Undercity. And if it is that Vander gets captured, then who's going to take over in the Undercity then? Is it Silco? Because that will definitely lead to a lot more death and destruction. And then you start the episode, and 2-3 minutes in, they kill Grayson. She's out now. There's nothing keeping the peace in between Piltover and the Undercity, and Silco also captures Vander over here, immediately raising the stakes tremendously. We also here learn a lot about the backstory in between Vander and Silco, what it was that happened, how they initially were friends who had this vision about the nation of Zorn, but then Vander was pushed to a moment where he had to choose in between the nation of Zorn or his daughters in Vi and Powder, and he chose his daughters. So there's a lot of conflict in between over them. Now Silco then captures Vander and have the hope that Vi and her buddies will come and try and free him, which they obviously do, and when they do so, they also make the crucial choice of leaving Powder behind, which of course Powder already is dealing with a lot of abandonment issues, having her parents be killed as a kid and having constantly be undermined and bullied by both Milo and Clagger. So they go over there and they try to free Vander, and they're very close to actually doing it. They get into a fight, they close the door, Milo gets the lock on Vander open, Clagger breaks down the back door, and they're very close to getting out. But at the same time, Powder has taken the gemstone she found in Piltover, and she created a bomb. And it's fascinating because they edit this in a way so we kind of see the full effect of the bomb from all the different perspectives. So it starts off with just wiping out Deckard, and it wipes out Sevika and the guards around over there, and it kind of goes on, so you also see that Powder gets flung off of the roof. But then you also see that the bomb also stretches down, ignites the shimmer, and reaches all the way over to Singed. And it's that moment that you kind of realize, damn, if it went that far, how far did it? Oh no. So we see then that it blasts through the door, it instantly kills Clagger and Milo, and it destroys almost everything around. It leads to a very intense encounter, ultimately leading to Vander's death. And the scene afterwards is some of the best writing I have ever seen. Having the confrontation when Vi is standing there over Vander's dead body, all of her friends just died, and they lost so much because of Powder.
Why? Why did you do this?
I was saving you.
When she finds out that Powder was the one who did this, my god, the voice acting, the expressions in the animation, the writing and the dialogue they have, it's incredible. Because you can tell there's a lot behind it where it is that Powder is dealing with wanting to help and is dealing with her own abandonment issues, and ultimately Vi is confirming every single insecurity that Powder has. She's telling her like, you're a jinx, you screw up everything that you're dealing with.
Why did you leave me?
Because you're a jinx! Do you hear me? Milo was right!
No.
And crazy enough, she also punches Powder in the face. It is incredibly dark, it's very heavy, but it is nothing short but incredibly meaningful. And it's also insane seeing that moment where it is that Vi ultimately makes the decision of like, I'm not helping anything by being here right now. I need to remove myself from this situation and calm down. The most mature choice you can make in that instance. And when she stands up, you can also see that Powder cowers because she thinks she's gonna get punched again by Vi, which is fucked up in itself, right? But it's also so interesting because Vi over here makes the decision that is arguably the most mature decision to do in this kind of situation. But that one decision is ultimately what leads to everything else happening. Powder getting picked up by Silco and then turning into Jinx over time. It is such an explosive and incredibly heartfelt and tragic episode, and it features some of the best writing I have ever seen. Some of the best animation, well, no, the best animation I've ever seen. It truly is the episode you point to where you say, if you're not hooked on Arcane, then see the first 3 episodes, because this episode it's gonna instantly pull in anyone because the writing is just that good. Number 2, Season 6, Episode 7 of Better Call Saul, Plan and Execution. Oh man, this is a core TV memory for me. I remember when it was that Season 6 was releasing and I was following it every week. We were looking at the new episodes. Now this is the mid-season finale of the last season of Better Call Saul. So there was the first 7 episodes, then a 1.5 month break, and then you have the final 6 episodes, I think it is. And it's so funny because Thomas Schnauz, the director of this episode, he had tweeted just before this was released and was like, just so you guys know, we actually didn't plan on it to be a 1.5 month break. We thought it was all going to be released as the same. So like, don't expect any big cliffhangers or same that we got from Breaking Bad when Hank read in the book or something like that. Don't expect anything like that. Cheeky bastard. Now after 6 episodes, a very mysterious and also very intense build-up of the scheme that Kim and Jimmy is doing towards Howard and HHM, we finally see it pay off. The mediation scene that we have is extremely interesting because we've had 6 episodes of setup, and now the script is just gonna machine gun fire out payoffs that is going on within 7 minutes of screen time. It is insane how much stuff gets paid off in this one scene. It's literally just payoff after payoff after payoff after payoff. But if you ignore the screenwriting techniques, emotionally watching this scene feels like watching a car crash in slow motion. Because you see quite early on where it's gonna go, but it's just slowly getting worse and worse, and you feel like you're just clenching your fists and going like, oh god. And then also cutting back to Jimmy and Kim, who had been listening to the whole thing and is now getting it on to Howard's downfall. The nuances and complexities in Better Call Saul is incomparable to a lot of other stuff out there. Now this is all going down at the same time that Lalo is slowly zeroing on Gus. So we see Lalo have now located the laundromat, and he is sitting there patiently waiting day in and day out for the right moment to strike. He's starting to feel like, okay, it's about moment for strike. So he then calls up Hector, both as a way to just, you know, share with his loved one what he's gonna do, because Hector's the only one that knows that Lalo is alive. The subtext of it is also that if you know what I'm gonna do now, if I don't come back, then you know what happened. But then when he's calling to Hector, he can see signs that the phone line is tapped. And it's interesting because Lalo being a character that has been defined by how calm, methodic, patient, and calculated it is, right? Seeing this moment where he's just flipping out and smashing this chair is very interesting to see. So that forces him to improvise. And that's also when he sees the cockroach running by, which I thought was a really funny reference to one season prior when he was talking to Kim about Jimmy.
Your man, he's like the cucaracha, you know? Born survivor.
So at Jimmy and Kim's apartment, we then get the confrontation in between them and Howard. This scene is really, really interesting because in the first 3-4 seasons of Better Call Saul, Howard was an asshole. It was horrible, you know? It's really interesting because now when you see this scene, you see our main characters and our perspective characters and Howard, and you can't help but side with everything that Howard says in this scene. He is essentially calling out Jimmy and Kim on all of their bullshit and all of their crazy actions and trying to understand why. What was it that made you guys want to do this so badly towards me?
I thought you did it for the money, but now it's so clear. Screw the money. You did it for fun. You get off on it. You're like Leopold and Loeb, 2 sociopaths.
All right, that's enough.
Oh, you know it's true. You just have the guts to admit it.
This is also endlessly fascinating to me because we have had moments where people have done this towards Jimmy before, but it's come from Chuck. And when it has come from Chuck, even though he's saying things that are right and that most people can agree with, it always comes from a very resentful and spiteful place. That's kind of what defined Chuck as a character. He was constantly doing the right thing for the wrong reasons. Because he was doing the right things, but he was doing it because he's an asshole and he hates Jimmy, you know? And since Chuck is such an unlikable guy, we sided with Jimmy every time, even though what he was saying was mostly true, right? But it's so interesting seeing over here that since Howard has grown on us so much over the show, we can't help but side with Howard a lot in this scene. Now, this also then gets changed where you see that candle blow over and Lalo comes here.
Can I come in? Truth. Believe it. You can't hide who you really are forever.
Howard?
This whole situation just amped their stakes up 100 times. And of course, Howard at first doesn't realize the seriousness. He doesn't know who this guy is, so he was just like playing it off as nothing.
Who are you? Me? Nobody. I just need to talk to my lawyers.
Oh, is that right? You want some advice? Find better lawyers.
Patrick Fabian is also fantastic acting over here, where you can see that he is suddenly starting to realize the significance of the situation, and he just tries to switch over. And of course, Jimmy and Kim being like, Howard, you need to leave right now. And of course, you know, anybody who knows Lalo know that that's not an option. He of course says like, you know, you can stay, do your thing, you know. And Lalo kills him. Like it's nothing. We've spent the whole season so far watching Jimmy and Kim methodically and very calculated burn Howard's reputation and persona to the ground. And here he gets wasted. As if it's nothing. It's nothing other than tragic, and it's extremely meaningful, and the emotional roller coaster they go through this show and the absolutely impeccable writing is fantastic. And luckily Thomas Schnauz doesn't end on a cliffhanger like he promised, so you know, that's all good. Now, my number one on the list is Breaking Bad, Season 5, Episode 16, titled Felina. Yes, I know. Episode 14, Ozymandias, best episode of TV ever made. I know, I usually say the same thing as well. I feel like there are a million of video essays just on Ozymandias alone, because it is widely regarded to be the greatest hour of TV ever created. So I felt like I wanted to talk about another episode of the show, and then I'd like to spend some time on the finale, titled Felina. Often referred to as one of the greatest conclusions of any TV show or any story ever. It's very, very impressive watching Felina and kind of seeing how many loose ends they managed to tie up just within the episode alone. Everything from Walt's initial goal of giving his money to his family, to offing his rivals, setting Jesse free, and even all the way down to tying up a loose end of people like Lydia and Badger and Skinny Pete, you know? I mean, ultimately Walter does achieve his initial goal as well of giving the money to his family via Gretchen and Elliot, and he also gets to terrify them. And I mean, in his head, that's kind of him getting revenge of Gretchen and Elliot for how they screwed him out of Grey Matter. He even tells them like,
cheer up, beautiful people. This is where you get to make it right.
But it's so funny because, of course, we don't see this when it actually happens, but we think it will happen because Walt terrifies them via having 2 assassins in the backyard, and he ensures them that regardless what they do, if they don't pay him, those people are going to kill them in there. And it's a brilliant reveal showing that that was actually just Badger and Skinny Pete with laser pointers. Fantastic, because one, it's just a hilarious reveal, but it's also a fun way to kind of conclude those characters over there as well. It's also a very realistic way for Walt to get the information that there's blue meth out there again. I mean, they say that they think it's him, so then Walter understands that it's Jesse who's cooking it again, thinking that he has partnered up with Jack. So since he thinks that Jesse has partnered up with the man that took his life's work and also killed Hank, he gets furious. So he then purchases the machine gun that we saw in the flash forward in the opening in episode 1. Funny enough that when they did that almost a year earlier, they actually had no clue what it was for. They didn't know how they were going to pay it off. Quite insane that they managed to do it well, right? And he then goes to Jack and his crew with the intention of offing everybody, including Jesse. But then when he sees that Jesse is in fact not Jack's partner, he is a slave to them, then he ultimately takes a very, very good choice and decides to save Jesse in that instance. Now he then kills everyone except Todd. It's very satisfying to see Todd being left behind and dying at Jesse's hands, because of course there's a lot of tension in between Jesse and Todd. I mean, everything from killing Drew Sharp to killing Andrea to being the person who's taking care of him in this cage and whilst cooking and everything, and all of that was having this emotionless, careless look on his face, not to mention combining all that with the crazy stuff we see in El Camino. It's a very satisfying send-off. Then just after that whole shootout, you also get the reveal that Walt had slipped ricin into Lydia's stevia tea, so now she's gonna go as well. But then the interaction in between them afterwards is brilliant, because there's no dialogue, it's just via looks, and Walter is looking at Jesse and kind of nodding his head, which is his way of saying like, go on. I know I've kept you on a leash and I know I've come after you multiple times before. I'm not gonna come after you anymore. You're free to go. And I just love the look that Jesse is giving back, because all of the emotional and physical damage and trauma that Jesse has been through, you can pin back on Walt. But at the end of the day, Walter chose to save Jesse, and he also took a ricochet bullet at the same time, so saving Jesse in that instance, it's probably going to cost Walter his life. Ultimately, the last look that Jesse gives him, it's not one of gratitude, because ultimately all the trauma that comes from it is something that has happened because of Walt. But it's not one of spite either, because Walt ultimately did give his life for Jesse as well. Just a fantastic interaction in between those two. And of course, that shot going up in between the bars to Baby Blue is incredible. and Walt dying in his lab and just watching the cookware is fantastically handled. But I do want to focus though on my favorite part of the whole episode, which I also think might be one of my favorite payoffs in any story ever. So if you look at the entire show, of course Walt started off doing what he was doing as an action of setting up for his family. He was doing it all for the family and making sure that they were going to be left with some means to financially secure themselves in the future. So it always started off doing that, but the show is largely about how the sense of the motivation of doing it for your family, that gets a little bit faded over time, and we saw these other things start to matter more, which is also like in season 5 where he keeps talking about that what I do for my family.
This changes nothing. What I do for my family.
In the beginning it's just a little bit like, yeah, but I think you also like what you're doing at the side. Whilst towards the end you're like, dude, you're not fooling anyone. We know why you're doing this. So then when it is that Skylar and Walt are talking together, he also says like, Skylar, I need you to know. And she even says also like, motherfucker, if I need to hear that one time again, I'm gonna kill you.
You need to understand.
I have to hear one more time that you did this for the family.
I did it for me. I liked it. I was good at it. And I was alive.
I can barely express how brilliant the writing is in this first scene. We've known for a long time, it feels so obvious, but yet it's still so unexpected, because they've written him in a way where you never thought that he would have the self-awareness of his own flaws and also owning them like this, right? And then also ending that moment where it is that he asks Skylar, like, before I go, can I see her? And we see him actually like seeing his daughter, and all of that is giving a little bit of an insight of the person who Walter White was at heart. He was a very caring and loving father and husband. Regardless of all of his actions, you can tell that he always cared incredibly for his family. But what's interesting and what you also learn over time is that regardless of how much he cares for his family, they are ultimately number two. That's his main motivation, is always to serve himself. It's why he becomes so manipulative both towards Walter Jr. and Skylar in a lot of instances, and seeing him admit to that is amazing. And ultimately I think that that whole scene is kind of the conclusion of Walter White, whilst everything else is, you know, the conclusion to Heisenberg, right? So yeah, Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, two best shows of all time, and all of the rest ones are either fantastic shows or just fantastic episodes and okay shows. But yeah, that's been a lot of yapping and a lot of analyzing of some of my favorite TV episodes of all time. There's more where these come from, so if it is that you guys like it, then let me know and I might do another one at one point. Otherwise, happy Christmas or happy New Year's, depending on how slow I'm gonna be with uploading this. But yeah, thanks a lot. See you guys.